Alright, just seeing if this is going through, and it looks like it is. I'm using a new software today because I looked back and the audio sounded like crap on the first video. So, looks like everything is working right now. If it's not, let me know. But yeah, welcome to Read Aloud number 2. Nobody really tuned in for the first one, but that's fine, because I'm not doing this for anyone else besides myself. I like reading out loud, and if anyone wants to join me, they can. So throw in a comfy sweater, get in your blankets, and we're gonna read today. Oh, there's something in my eye. Whew. Anyway, alright, welcome. So, we're reading Wicked Lovely by Melissa Marr. And we left off at the beginning of chapter 3. Aislin has just told Seth that she can see fairies, and that's who's stalking her, and that's the reason that that's the reason that she's acting so weird recently. That's kind of where we left off. We met all of the characters because it was the beginning of the book. But yeah. Alright, so starting off, chapter 3. Aislin closed her eyes as she finished describing the fairies who'd been stalking her. They're court fae, I know that much. They move in a circle of a king or a queen, have enough influence to act without consequences. They're too strong, too arrogant to be anything else. She thought about their disdain, their disregard for the fae watching them. These were the most dangerous sort of fairies, ones with power. She shivered and added, I just don't know what they want. There's this whole other world no one else sees, but I do. I watch them, but they've never noticed me, not any more than they do anyone else. So you see others that aren't following you? It was such a simple question, and such an obvious one. She looked at him and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so awful. Tears ran down her face. He just waited, calm, unflappable, until she stopped laughing. I guess that was a yes? Yes. She wiped her cheeks. They're real, Seth. It's not that I see things. They're fairies, creatures, almost everywhere. Awful things, beautiful ones, some that are both at once. Sometimes they're horrible to each other, doing really... She shuddered at the images that she didn't want to share with him. Bad, sick things. He waited. This Keenan, he approached me, made himself look like a human, and tried to get me to go with him. She looked away, trying to summon the calm she'd relied on when the thing she saw got too weird. It wasn't working. So what about this court thing? Could you talk to their king or whatever? Seth turned the page. Aislin listened to the soft whisper of paper falling, loud in the room despite the music, despite the impossibility of hearing such a soft sound. Since when can I hear a sheet of paper falling? She thought about Keenan, thought about how to explain the sense of strength he exuded. He'd seemed immune to the iron downtown, a terrifying possibility at the very least. He'd been strong enough to hold the glamour around it. Dead Girl had seemed weakened by it, but it hadn't repelled her either. No, Graham says court fae are the cruelest ones. I don't think I could face anything stronger even if I could reveal myself, and I can't. They can't find out that I can see them. Graham says they'll kill or blind us if they find out we see them. Suppose there's something else, Ash. Seth was moving now, standing in front of her. What if there's another explanation for what you saw? She folded her hand into a loose fist as she stared at him, feeling her fingernails dig ever so slightly into the palm of her hand. I'd love to believe that there's another answer. I've seen them since I was born. Graham sees them. It's real. They're real. She couldn't look at him. Instead, she stared down at Boomer, who had twisted his entire length into a tight coil in her lap. She trailed her finger down the side of his head gently. Seth cupped her chin and tilted her head back so she was looking at him. There's got to be something we can do. Can we talk about it tomorrow? She shook her head. I just can't deal with any more tonight. Seth reached down and lifted Boomer. The boa didn't uncoil as Seth carried him to his terrarium and gently lowered him onto the heat rock. She didn't say anything else as Seth latched the lid to keep Boomer from wandering off. Given half a chance, Boomer found a way to slither outside if he was left home alone, and in most months the temperature out there would be fatal for him. Come on, I'll walk you home, Seth said. You don't need to. He crooked his eyebrow and held out his hand. But you can. She took his hand. Seth led her through the streets, as unaware of Faye as everyone else they passed. But just having his arm around her made it seem less awful. They walked silently for almost a block, then he asked, "Do you want to stop at Rianne's?" "Why?" Aislin walked a little faster as the wolf girl who'd given chase earlier started circling predatorially. "Her party, the one you told me about?" Seth grinned, acting like they were okay, like the whole fairy conversation hadn't happened. God, no, that's the last thing I need. She shivered at the thought. She'd taken Seth to a couple of parties with the Bishop OC crowd. By the second one, it was pretty clear that the mixing of the two worlds was typically a bad plan. "You need my jacket?" Seth pulled her closer, attentive as always to the slightest detail. She shook her head no, but leaned closer to him, enjoying the excuse to be held by him. He didn't object, but he didn't let his hands brush anywhere they shouldn't either. He might flirt, but he never made a move that was anything other than just friends. "Stop at Pins and Needles with me?" he asked. The tat shop wasn't out of the way, and she wasn't in any hurry to be away from Seth. She nodded, then asked, "Did you finally pick something to get?" "Not yet, but Glenn said the new guy started this week. I thought I'd see what his work looks like. What styles, you know?" She laughed. Right, wouldn't want to get any of the wrong style. Mock scowling, he tweaked a strand of her hair. "We could find one we both like. Get a matched pair." "Sure, I'll do that. Right after you meet Grams and convince her to sign a consent form." "So no ink for you then?" "Ever." She's nice. The argument was an old one, but she hadn't given up yet, or made any progress. "Nope, not gonna risk it." He kissed her forehead. "As long as she doesn't meet me, she can't look at me and say, 'Stay away from my girl.'" "Nothing wrong with how you look." "Yeah?" He smiled gently. "Would she think that?" Aislin thought so, but she hadn't been able to convince Seth of it. They continued in silence until they reached the shop. The front of the tat shop was almost all windows, making it seem less intimidating to any curious ink seekers. But unlike the tattoo parlor she'd seen when they went up to Pittsburgh, this was not a glossy shop. Pins and Needles retained some of the grit of the art, not catering to the trendy crowd. Not that Huntsdale had much of a trendy crowd. The cowbell on the door clanged when they walked in. Rabbit, the owner, peeked out of one of the rooms, waved, and disappeared. Seth went to a long coffee table against the wall that had portfolios piled on top of it. He found the new one and sat down with it. "You want to look with me?" "Nope." Aislin went up to the glass case where bars, rings, and studs were laid out. That's what she wanted. She only had a single hole in each ear, but every time they came in, she considered getting a piercing. Nothing in her face, though. Not this year. Bishop O'Connell High School had strict rules about facial piercings. One of the two piercers stood up behind the cabinet. "You ready for elaborate yet?" "Not until I graduate." She shrugged and went back to cleaning the glass. The bell clanged again. Leslie, a friend from school, walked in with a heavily inked guy, far from the sort she dated. He was beautiful. Close cropped hair, perfect features, blue-black eyes. He was also fey. Aislin froze, watching him, feeling the world tilt under her. Too many fairies wearing human faces tonight. Too many strong fae. But this fairy barely looked her way as he went into the back room, trailing his hands over one of the steel-framed jewelry cabinets he passed. She couldn't look away. Not yet. Most fairies didn't walk downtown. They didn't touch iron bars, and they sure as hell didn't walk around able to hold a glamour while touching poisonous metal. There were rules. She'd lived by those rules. There were a few exceptions, the rare, strong fae, but not this many, not at the same time, and not in her safe spaces. "Ash?" Leslie reached out her hand. "Hey, are you all right?" Aislin shook her head. "Nothing is right anymore. Nothing. I'm good." She looked toward the room where the fairy waited. "Who's your friend?" "Tasty, isn't he?" Leslie made a noise somewhere between a moan and a sigh. "I just met him outside." Seth put the book down and crossed the room. "You ready to go?" He slid a steadying arm around Aislin's waist. "I can—" In a sec, she glanced at the fairy with Rabbit. Their voices were barely more than a whisper. Forcing her paranoia aside, she turned her attention to Leslie. "You're not taking him to Ree's, are you?" "Uriel? What, you don't think he'd be a hit?" "He's certainly different than your usual." She bit her lip and tried to act like everything was normal. "Partners?" Leslie shot him a longing look. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem interested. Aislin held in the sigh of relief that Leslie wasn't going to try to pursue the fairy. Life was already complicated enough. I wanted to see if you're coming to the party, Leslie grinned, somewhat viciously at Seth. Both of you. No, Seth didn't elaborate. He tolerated Leslie, but tolerate was the best he could do. Most of the girls who went to Bishop O.C. weren't people he'd willingly hung with. Something better going on? Leslie asked in a conspiratorial voice. Always. I only go to those fiascos if she insists, Seth gestured towards Aislin. You ready? 5 minutes, Aislin murmured, and then felt guilty immediately. It wasn't like they were on a date or anything. She didn't want to make Seth wait, but she didn't want to leave a friend alone with a fairy strong enough to touch iron. She certainly wasn't leaving a friend alone with one wearing a human guise that would make even the shyest girls pant, and Leslie definitely wasn't shy. Aislin glanced back at Seth. If you want to head out, I can go with Leslie. No. He gave her a briefly irritated look before he wandered away to look at the flash on the walls. So what are you doing? Leslie asked. What? Aislin looked back at Leslie, who was grinning. Oh, nothing really. He's just walking me home. Leslie tapped her fingernails on the glass case, oblivious to the piercer's glares as she did so. Aislin knocked Leslie's hand off the case. What? And that's better than a party? Leslie linked an arm around Aislin and whispered, When are you going to give the poor thing a break, Ash? It's sad, really, how you string him along. We're friends. He'd say something if he... She lowered her voice and glanced back at Seth. You know. He's talking, girl. You're just too thick to hear it. He's just flirty. Even if he means it, I don't want a one-nighter, especially with him. Leslie shook her head and sighed melodramatically. You need to live a little, girl. There's nothing wrong with a quick love if they're good, and I hear he's good. Aislin didn't want to think about him with other girls. She knew Seth went out, even if she didn't see the other girls. She was sure they were there. Better to just be friends than one of his throwaway girls. She didn't want to talk about Seth, so she asked Leslie, Who's going tonight? Trying to keep unpleasant thoughts at bay, Aislin half listened to Leslie go on about the party. Rianne's cousin had invited some of the guys from his frat. Glad we're skipping it. Seth would hate that crowd. When Leslie's brother walked in, Seth came back over and put his arm around Aislin's shoulder, almost territorially, while they walked away. Leslie mouthed, Death. Aislin leaned on Seth, ignoring Leslie, her brother's comments about scoring some X, the fairy in the back room, all of it. When Seth was beside her, she could keep it all together. Why would she be stupid enough to risk what they had? To risk him for a fling. Chapter 4. On the outskirts of Huntsdale, an gorgeous Victorian estate that no realtor could sell or remember to show, Keenan hesitated, and hand lifted, he paused, watching silent figures in the thorn-heavy garden move as fluidly as the shadows that danced under the icy trees. The frost never melted in this yard, never would, but the mortals passing on the street only saw shadows. They looked away, if they dared look at all. No one, mortal or fae, stepped on Maria's frigid lawn without her consent. It was anything but inviting. Behind him, cars drove by on the street, tires grinding the frozen slush into the dirty gray mess. But the sound was muted by an almost tangible chill that rested like a pall over Maria's home. It hurt to breathe. Welcome home. Of course, it never felt like home. But then again, Bria had never felt like a mother. Inside her domain, the air itself made him ache, sapped the little strength he had. He tried to resist it, but until he came into his full power, she could send him to his knees, and she did, every single visit. Maybe Aislin will be the one. Maybe she'll make it different. Keenan braced himself and knocked. Bria flung open the door. In her free hand, she held a tray of steaming chocolate cookies aloft. She leaned forward and kissed the air near his face. Cookies, darling? She looked as she had for the past half century or so when he stopped in for these little damnable meetings. A mockery of mortal epitome of motherhood. She was clad in a modest floral dress, frilly apron, and a single strand of pearls. Her hair was twisted up in what she called a chignon. She wiggled the little tray. They're fresh, just for you. No. Ignoring her, he walked into the room. She'd redecorated again, some modern nightmare, complete with this sleek silver table, stiff, awkwardly shaped black chairs, and framed black and white prints of murderers, hangings, and a few torture scenes. Excuse me. The walls alternated between a stark white and flat black, with large geometric patterns on the opposite color. Selected images on the hanging prints, a dress, lips, bleeding wounds, were hand-painted red. Those splashes of luridness were the only true color in the room. It fit her far better than the costume she insisted on wearing when he'd visited. From behind the wet bar, a badly bruised wood sprite asked, "Drink, sir?" "Keenan, sweetheart, tell the girl what you want. I need to check on the toast." Bria paused, still holding the tray of cookies. You are staying for dinner, aren't you, dear?" "Do I have a choice?" He ignored the sprite to walk over to a print on the far wall. It was a woman with cherry-red lips stared out from the platform of gallows. Behind her were craggy dunes that seemed to go on endlessly. He glanced over at Berea. "One of yours?" "In the desert? Darling, really?" Blushing, she looked down, giving him a coquettish smile and toying with her pearls. "Even with the lovely chill I've had growing these past few centuries, that place is still off limits. For now, but it's sweet of you to ask." Keenan turned back to the print. The girl stared out at him, seeming desperate. He wondered if she had truly died there or if it was merely a model for a photographer. "Well, you get comfortable. I'll be back in a jiff. Then you can tell me about your new girl." "You know I do look forward to these little visits." Then, humming a lullaby from his childhood, something about frozen fingers, Berea left to check on the roast. He knew that if he'd followed her, there would be a bevy of unhappy wood sprites bustling about her restaurant-sized kitchen. Berea's cloyingly sweet act didn't include actual cooking, just the image of the sort of mother who would cook. "Drink, sir?" The sprite carried over 2 trays, one with milk, tea, hot cocoa, and a variety of prepackaged nutritional drinks. The other had carrot sticks, celery, apples, and other equally mundane foods. "Your mother is most insistent that you have a healthy snack." The sprite glanced in the direction of the kitchen. "And it's not wise to anger the mistress." He took a cup of tea and an apple. "You think?" Growing up in the Winter Court had made him far too familiar with what happened to those who angered or even irritated the Winter Queen. But he would do his best to anger her. That's what he'd come to do, after all. "Almost ready," Berea announced as she returned. She sat on one of the awful chairs and patted the one nearest her. "Come, tell me everything." Keenan sat in the chair across from her, keeping his distance as long as he could. "She's difficult. Resisted my initial approach." He paused, thinking of the fear in Aislin's eyes. It wasn't the response he usually elicited from mortal girls. "She didn't trust me at all." "I see." Berea nodded, crossed her ankles, and leaned forward, the picture of an attentive parent. "And did, the last girlfriend approve of her?" Without looking away from him, Berea motioned to the sprite, who promptly brought her a glass of something clear to drink. As Berea wrapped her hand around the stem of the glass, frost crept over it until the outside of the glass was entirely coated in a thin white layer. Dania agreed to her. Berea tapped her fingernails on the side of her glass. "Lovely. And how is Dawn?" Keenan ground his teeth. Berea knew Dania's name. After over half a century as Winter Girl, Dania had been around enough that his mother's feigned memory slip bordered on comical. "Dania is as she has been for decades, Mother. She's angry with me. She's tired. She's everything you've made her." Berea lifted her other manicured hand to examine it idly. "What I made her? Oh, do tell." "It's your staff, your binding, your treachery that started this game. You knew that would happen with mortals when they took your chill. Mortals aren't made for—" "Ah, sweetling, but you asked for her to do it. You chose her, and she chose you." Berea sat back in her chair, smug now that he was angry. She held open her hand, and the staff in question drifted into her grip, a reminder of the power she wielded. "She could have joined your little coterie of summer girls, but she thought it was worth the risk. She thought you were worth risking the pain she's in now." She tissed at him. Sad, really. She was such a pretty girl, so full of life." "She still is." "Is she now?" Bria lowered her voice to a stage whisper. I hear she's getting weaker and weaker. She paused and feigned a pout. Just sick with it. It'd be a shame if she fades. Dania's fine. He heard the edge in his voice, hated that she could anger him so easily. The idea of Dania becoming a shade, dying, but trapped and silent for eternity, was one that never failed to rouse his temper. Fae death was always a tragedy, for there was no afterlife for the Fae. It's why she mentions it. How his father had ever put up with Bria long enough for the two to conceive him was beyond him. The woman was infuriating. Bria made a purring noise, almost a growl, deep in her throat. Let's not argue, dear. I'm sure Diane will be fine until the new girl can be convinced you're worth such a sacrifice. Why, with being so ill, she might not even work against you this time. Maybe she'll encourage the new loveling to accept you instead of telling her all those awful tales of your wicked intentions. Dania will do her part. I'll do mine. Nothing changes, not till I find the Summer Queen. Keenan stood up and stepped forward until he was looking down at Bria. He couldn't afford to let her browbeat him, no matter that she still held all the power, no matter that she'd sooner kill him than help him. Kings didn't grovel. Kings commanded. His power might be bound, no more than a warm breath against a glacial cold, but he was still the Summer King. He still stood against her, and he couldn't let her ignore that. Might as well get it over with. You know I'll find her, Mother. One of these girls will take the staff in hand, and your cold won't fill her. Bria sat down her glass and looked up at him. Really? I hate this part. Keenan leaned down and put a hand on either side of her chair. One day I'll have the full strength of the Summer King, just as Father did. Your reign will end. No more growing cold. No more unchecked power. He lowered his voice, hoping to hide the trembling. Then we'll see who's truly stronger. She sat there for a moment, silent and still. Then she put one cold hand on his chest and stood, pushing him ever so slightly. Ice formed in a web growing outward from her hand, crawling over him until he ached so fiercely that he couldn't have moved if the wild hunt itself were bearing down on him. What a charming speech. It gets more entertaining every time, like one of those TV shows. She kissed both of his cheeks, leaving behind a frostbitten trace of her lips, letting her cold seep under his skin, reminding him that she, not me, not yet, had all the power. That's one of the lovely things about our little arrangement. If I had to deal with the real king, I'd miss our games. Keenan didn't answer. Couldn't. If he were gone, would another fill his place? Nature abhors a vacuum. Would a new king, an unbound king, come into power? She'd taunted him with that. If he'd want to protect them, end it. Let a real king reign. But would another king ascend with full power if he failed? He had no way of knowing. He swayed on his feet, hating her, hating the whole situation. Then Bria leaned in and whispered, and so her icy breath blew against his lips. I'm sure you'll find your little queen. Perhaps you already have. Maybe it was Shoban, or that Eliza from a few centuries back. Now she was a sweet girl, Eliza. Would have made a lovely queen, don't you think? Keenan shivered, his body starting to shut down from the cold. He tried to push the cold back, push it out. I am the Summer King. She cannot do this. He swallowed, concentrating on staying upright. Imagine all this time, all these centuries, if she were right there in the bevy of girls too weak to risk it, too timid to pick up the staff and find out. Several fox maidens came into the room. His room was ready, mistress. The poor dear is tired, and he was so unpleasant to his mummy. She sighed as if it had truly wounded her. With one finger under his chin, she tilted his head back. To bed without dinner again. One of these times you'll be able to stay awake. She kissed him on the chin. Maybe. Then everything went dark, as fox maidens carried him off to the room Bria kept for him. On to Chapter 5. Dania knew Bria approached when the wind shifted, bringing a new wave of biting cold over the cottage, as if it would be anyone else. No one visited despite the location of Dania's cottage, outside the iron-laden city in one of the few wooded areas in reach of Huntsdale. When Keenan had chosen Huntsdale, they had all followed him and settled into their homes to wait. She'd picked the cottage, she thought, hoped the Fae would have their revelries among these trees, but they didn't. They wouldn't. No one got too close to her if Keenan still had a claim. Not even the representatives of the other Fae courts came near her. Only the heads of the summer and winter courts dared approach. Dania opened her door and stepped back. No pretending I don't know she's here. Bria blew through the doorway, posing like some old vampy actress on the threshold. After air kissing and artificial pleasantries, she stretched out on the sofa, crossing her ankles, dangling her dainty feet off the edge. The femme fatale image was ruined only by the crude staff she held lightly in her hand. I was just thinking about you, darling. I'm sure. The staff wasn't any danger to her. Not now. But Dania walked away. She had leaned against the stone wall by the hearth. Warmth seeped into her skin, not enough to assuage the cold that slithered over her, but better than sitting near the source of that awful chill. The cold never bothered Bria. She was of it, and thus could control it. Dania carried it inside her, but not in comfort, not without yearning for warmth. Bria didn't seek warmth. She reveled in the cold, wearing it like a cloud of icy perfume, especially when it made the others suffer. My baby stopped in this evening, Bria said in her usual deceptive, casual voice. I figured he would. Dania tried to keep her voice even, but despite decades of practice, the edge of concern slipped out. She folded her arms over her chest, embarrassed that she still worried about Keenan. Bria smiled at Dania's reaction and let the pause grow uncomfortably long. Then, still smiling, stretched out over her free hand as if a glass would materialize in it. It didn't. With a long-suffering sigh, she looked around. Still no servants? No. Really, Sweets, you simply must get a few. The wood sprites are an obedient sort. Can't stand a brownie, though. She made an unpleasant face. Terribly independent lot. I could lend you a few of my sprites just to help out. And spy on me? Well, of course, but that's really a minor detail. She flustered her hand airily. The place is squalid, truly. It's worse than the last one, the other little city. Or was that another of my son's discarded lovers? It's so hard to remember. Dania didn't take the bait. It's clean. But still so blah, no style. Bria trailed her fingers over the sandstone carvings on the rough-hewn table by the sofa. These aren't from your time. She'd picked up a bear fetish, its right paw raised, miniature claws exposed. This was Lisley's work, right? Dania nodded, although an answer wasn't necessary. Bria knew exactly whose it was. It irritated Bria that Lisley still visited Dania and Keenan. She hadn't done so in a few years, but she would again. Since she'd been freed from the burden of carrying Bria's cold, she wandered the world, often choosing desert regions where there was no chance of seeing Bria or her ilk. Every few years she showed up to remind Dania that the cold wouldn't last forever, no matter how many times it seemed like it would. And those awful ragged pants you insist on wearing? Rika's. We're the same size. Rika hadn't visited in more than 2 decades. But she was a strange girl, more at ease with carrying the cold than with the idea of being Keenan's queen. They were different, every one of them. All that the Winter Girls had in common was a strength of will. Better that than sharing treats with vapid summer girls who followed Keenan like children. Bria waited expectantly as Dania tried not to show her impatience. Giving in, Dania asked, "Do you have a reason for visiting?" "I have a reason for everything." Bria came to stand beside her. She rested her hand on the small of Dania's back. Dania didn't bother asking Bria to move her hand. Doing so would only encourage her to put it there more often in the future. "Are you going to tell me what it is?" "Tisk, you're worse than my son. Not as temperamental, though." Bria moved closer, sliding her hand around Dania's waist, digging her fingers into Dania's hip. "You'd be so much prettier if you dressed better. Maybe do something more flattering with your hair." Dania stepped away, ostensibly to prop open the back door, letting the growling cold out. She wished she were as temperamental as Keenan, but that wasn't the nature of the Summer King. He was as volatile as summer storms, moody and unpredictable, as likely to laugh as he was to rage, but it wasn't his power that flooded her, it was Bria's cold power that had filled Dania when she'd lifted the staff so long ago. If it hadn't, she'd be immune to the Winter Queen's chill. She would have just joined Keenan, had an eternity with him. But the chill that rested inside the Winter Queen's staff had filled her, consumed her until she was little more than a breathing extension of the Winter Queen's staff. Dania still wasn't sure whom she resented more, Keenan for convincing her he loved her, or Maria for killing that dream. If he truly loved her enough, wouldn't she be the one? Wouldn't she be his queen? Dania stepped outside. The trees were reaching toward the gray sky, gnarled limbs seeking the last bit of sun. Somewhere in the distance she heard the huffing of deer that wandered through the small nature preserve that abutted her yard. Familiar sights, comforting sounds. It should have been idyllic, but it wasn't. Nothing was peaceful when the game began. In the shadows she saw a score of Keenan's lackeys, Rowan men, fox fairies, and other court soldiers. Even those that looked almost mortal were still somehow strange to her after decades of their presence. They were always there, watching her, carrying word of her every move back to him. No matter that she told him innumerable times that she wanted them gone. No matter that she felt trapped by their watching and waiting. It is the order of things, Don. The Winter Girl is my responsibility. It's always been so. He tried to take her hand to wrap those now painful fingers around hers. She walked away. Not anymore. I mean it, Keenan. Get rid of them or I will. He hadn't stayed to see her weep, but she knew he'd heard. Everyone had. He didn't listen, though. He'd been too used to Rika's cooperation, too used to everyone kowtowing to him. So Dania had frozen a number of the guards during the first decade. If they came too close to her, she'd let a thick rime cover them until they couldn't move. Most had recovered, but not all. Keenan merely sent more. He didn't even complain. No matter how awful she was to him, he insisted on sending more guards to keep watch over her. And she kept lashing out, freezing them until eventually he told the next round of guards to stand in the safety of the furthest trees or the perch in the boughs of the yew and oak. It was a progressive sort. Bria stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. They still watch. Obedient little pawns he sends to watch over you. They saw you arrive. Keenan will know. She didn't look at Bria, staring instead at a young Rowan man who never kept his distance as well as the others. He winked. In the past decades, he'd rarely left his post outside her house. The others rotated in and out, saying constant in number, but not in face. The Rowan man was different. Although they never spoke more than a handful of words, she almost regarded him as a friend. Undoubtedly, but not now, Priya laughed, an awful sound that sounded like ravens squabbling over a carrion. Poor dear's out cold. Pretending she wasn't worried never worked. Showing concern never worked, so Dania looked toward the thicket, trying to change the topic before she asked how badly it had gone for Keenan. And where are your lackeys tonight? Bria made a come-here motion in the direction of the copse trees. They came then. A trio of enormous, shaggy black goats rounded the corner with 3 of Bria's faithful hags astride them. Though they were withered things, looking like the mere husks of women, the hags were eerily strong, able to rend the limbs from even the eldest mountain trolls. They terrified Dania as they cackled like mad hens and paraded around the yard, as if they dared Keenan's waiting guards to come closer. Dania stepped up to the porch rail, away from Bria, closer to the wretched women who served the Winter Queen. Looking lovely, Agatha. Agatha spat at her. It was foolish to taunt them, but Dania did it every time they came around. She had to prove, to herself and to them, that she wasn't intimidated. You do realize that it's not you who keep the guards at bay. Of course, it wasn't her threat either that made the guards keep their distance. If Keenan said they should approach, they would. Her desires be damned. Their injuries and deaths be damned. Keenan's will was all that mattered to them. The hags scowled at her, but they didn't answer. Like Keenan's guards, Bria's lackeys kept their distance from her. No one wanted to anger Bria, except Keenan. Talk about dysfunctional families. Both Keenan and Bria protected her as if the other one were a worse threat. When the hags refused to say anything, Dania turned to Bria. I'm tired. What do you want? For a moment, Dania thought she'd been too blunt, that Bria would lash out at her. The Winter Queen was usually as calculating as Keenan was capricious, but her temper was a truly horrifying thing when she did release it. Bria only smiled, a characteristically frightening smile, but less dangerous than anger. There are those who would see Keenan happy, those who want him to find the girl who will share the throne with him. I do not. She let the full weight of her chill roll off her. It slammed into Dania, leaving her feeling like she was being absorbed into the heart of a glacier. If she were still mortal, it would kill her. Bria lifted Dania's almost limp hand and wrapped it around the staff, under her own frigid hand. It didn't react, didn't change anything, but the mere touch of it brought back memories of those first few years when the pain was still raw. While Dania was struggling to breathe, Bria continued. Keep this one from taking the staff, and I'll withdraw my cold from you. Free you. He can't offer you that freedom. I can. Or... Bria traced a fingernail down the center of Dania's chest in a perverse mockery of a caress. If you'd rather, we can see how much cold I can push through you before it uses you up. Dania might be able to direct the chill, but she couldn't contain it. The cold poured out, answering Bria's touch, making quite clear who had the power. In a ragged voice, Dania said, I know my place. Convince her not to trust him. I agreed to that when I took up the staff. Don't fail, lie, cheat, whatever. Don't let her touch the staff. Bria flattened her palm on Dania's chest, fingers slightly curled, nails scraping skin through Dania's blouse. What? Dania stumbled forward, trying to flee Bria without angering her further, trying to make her thoughts focus. There were rules. Everyone knew them. They sucked for Keenan, but they were there. What Bria suggested was far outside the rules. Bria let go of the staff and wrapped her arm around Dania, holding her up, and whispered, If you fail me, it's well within my power to take away this body of yours. He can't stop me. You can't stop me. You'll be a shade, wandering colder than you can imagine. Think about it. Then she let go. Dania swayed on her feet, upright only because of the staff she was still clutching. She dropped the staff, sick at the touch of it in her hands, remembering the pain the first time she touched it. The despair each time the newest mortal didn't take it from her. Dania gripped the porch railing and tried to hold herself upright. It didn't work. Toodles! Bria gave Keenan's guards a finger wave and disappeared into the darkness with her hags. When Keenan woke, Bria sat in a rocker by the bed, a basket of scraps at her feet, a needle in her hand. Quilting? He coughed and cleared his throat. It was raw from the ice he'd swallowed when she'd frozen him. Isn't that a bit over the top, even for you? She held up the patches she'd sewn together. Do you think so? I'm rather good at it. He pushed himself upright. Thick furs, some still bloody, were piled over him. It's a far sight better than your real hobbies. She waved a hand in a gesture of dismissal, letting go of the needle. It still darted in and out of the cloth. She's not the one, the new girl. She could be. He thought of Aislin's obvious control of her emotions. She's the one I dream of. A fox maiden brought in a tray of hot drinks and steaming soup. She left them on the low table alongside his bed. So were the other ones, dear. Bria sighed and settled back into her chair. You know I don't want to fight with you. If I'd known what would happen, you were convinced that very day. How could I know that this would happen when I killed him? I didn't even know you were yet. That didn't explain why she'd bound his powers, why she'd used their common blood to have the dark court curse him. She never offered explanations for that, only for the origin of his mantle, not for the way she'd bound him. Keenan took a steaming cup of chocolate. The warmth felt wonderful in his hands, even better on his throat. Just tell me who she is, he said. When Bria didn't respond, Keenan continued. We can compromise. Divide the year, divide the regions, like it used to be with Father. Nope, sorry, that was Keenan reading that. When Bria didn't respond, Keenan continued, We can compromise. Divide the year, divide the regions, like it used to be with Father. He finished the cup and picked up another, just to feel the heat in his hands. She'd laughed then, setting in a tiny snow squall spiraling around the room. Give up everything? Wither like a hag? For what? Me? Because it's right? Because he swung his feet to the floor, wincing when they sank into the small snowdrift. Sometimes the old traditions were the worst, lines they'd exchanged like a script for centuries. I have to ask. You know that. Bria took the needle back in hand, jabbing it into the cloth. I do. Your father always asked too, followed every rule right down to the line. He was like that. She scowled and picked up another pat from the basket. So predictable. The mortals starve more every year. The cold, crops wither, people die. Keenan drew a deep breath and coughed again. The air in the room was frigid. Now that he was weakened, the longer he stayed in her presence, the longer it would be until he recovered. They need more sun. They need a proper summer king again. That's really not my concern. She dropped her quilting in the basket and turned to leave. She paused at the door. You know the rules. Right, the rules. Rules made in her favor, rules he'd been trapped for by a century. Yeah, I know the rules. Alright, that's the end of chapter 5. We'll be going on to chapter 6, but I want to drink some water. Is anything about you there? Oh, well, I've been going for a minute. Well, I hope you're enjoying the book. Alright, back to it. Chapter 6. On Monday, Aislin woke before the alarm went off. After a quick shower, she dressed in her uniform and went to the kitchen. Grams was at the stove, fixing eggs and bacon. Leaning over to give her a peck on the cheek, Aislin asked, Special occasion? Brat? Grams swatted at her. I just thought I'd cook you a good breakfast. Are you feeling okay? Aislin put a hand on Graham's forehead. Graham smiled wanly. You seem tired lately. Thought you could use something other than yogurt. Aislin poured a small cup of coffee from the half-full carafe and added a couple of generous spoonfuls of sugar before she came to stand beside Grams. SATs are coming up soon. Didn't do as well as I wanted on the last English essay. Aislin rolled her eyes as Graham shot her a disbelieving frown. Well, I didn't. I'm not saying that I did badly, just that I could have done better. Graham scooped the eggs into the waiting plates and went into the tiny table with them. So it's a school thing? Mostly. Aislin sat down and picked up her fork. She pushed the eggs around, staring at the plate. What else? Grams asked in a worried tone. Her hand tensed on her coffee mug. And Aislin couldn't tell her. She couldn't say that the court fairies were following her, that one of them had donned a glamour to talk to her, that it took everything she had not to reach out toward them when he stood behind her. So she mentioned... This is an interesting... Sorry. Should not have changed songs. Interesting. Must have reached the end of that playlist. One second. Sorry. There's something a little better. Back to it. Where was I? Alright. Graham scooped eggs into the waiting plates and went to the tiny table with them. So it's a school thing? Mostly. Aislin sat down and picked up her fork. She pushed the eggs around, staring at the plate. What else? Grams asked in a worried tone. Her hand tensed on her coffee mug. And Aislin couldn't tell her. She couldn't say that the court fairies were following her, that one of them had donned a glamour to talk to her, that it took everything she had not to reach out toward him when he stood beside her. So she mentioned the only other person that made her feel so tempted. There's this guy. Graham's grip on the cup relaxed a little. Aislin added, He's wonderful, everything I want, but he's just a friend. Do you like him? Aislin nodded. Then he's an idiot. You're smart and pretty, and if he turned you down, Aislin interrupted. I didn't actually ask him out. Well, there's your problem, Grams nodded with a self-satisfied look. Ask him out. Stop worrying. When I was a girl, we didn't have the sort of freedom you do, And Grams was off, talking about one of her favorite subjects, the progress in women's rights. Aislin ate her breakfast, nodding in the right places and asking questions to keep Grams from talking until it was time to leave for school. Far better to let Grams think that boys and school were the source of her worries. Grams had faced enough worries in her life. Grandpa had died when she was still a young mother, and she'd had to raise a daughter and then a granddaughter with the sight on her own. And if Grams found out how strange the Fae were acting, well, any chance of Aislin keeping her freedom would be quickly quashed. By the time Carla knocked on the door to walk to school, Aislin and Grams were both smiling. Then Aislin opened the door and saw 3 fairies standing in the hallway behind Carla. They kept their distance from the door, no doubt uncomfortable because of the wrought iron curcules that covered the outside of the door. Grams had needed special permission to install the new door, but it was well worth it. "Wow," Carla quipped when Aislin's smile faltered. "Not trying to ruin your mood." "No, it's not you. It's just," she tried to rein in the force of her scowl. "Monday, you know?" Excuse me. Carla looked to be sure that Grams wasn't in earshot and asked in a soft voice, "You want to ditch and get further behind in calc?" Aislin snorted. She grabbed her bag and waved to Grams before stepping into the hallway. Carla shrugged. "I'll tutor you if you want. There's a sale down at the electronics shop." "Not today. Come on." Aislin ran down the stairs past several more fairies. They didn't usually come into the apartment building. It was one of the safer areas. No greenery in sight, steel security bars on the windows. Not a bad neighborhood, but far from the dangerous trees and shrubs in the suburbs. As they walked a few blocks to school, Aislin's good mood vanished entirely. Fairies crouched in the alcoves, walked behind them, murmured as they passed. It was beyond disconcerting. And like an echo as she walked, she remembered Dead Girl's comment, "Run while you can." Aislin didn't think she could actually run, but if she knew what she was running from, it might at least cause the panic that she couldn't seem it might it might at least ease the panic that she couldn't seem to end. Then one of the lupine fairies sniffed her, crystalline fur clattering like tiny glass chimes as he moved, and Aislin trembled, maybe knowing wouldn't be enough to ease the panic. As Aislin went through her day, she pushed the morning's worries to the back of her mind. It wasn't like she could tell Father James she wasn't paying attention because fairies were following her. The church might caution against the dangers of the occult, but finding a modern priest who believed in anything supernatural, other than God himself, was about as likely as finding one who suggests women should be able to be priests too. Actually, she thought, with a wry smile as she headed toward her last period English class, there might be some priests out there who are more likely to suggest female equality, just not at Bishop O.C. Did you finish the reading?" Leslie asked as she yanked her bag out of her locker and slammed it shut. "Yeah." Aislin rolled her eyes. "Othello was an ass." Leslie winked and said, "They all are, sweetie. They all are." "How was the party?" Aislin asked as they slipped into the room. "Same as always, but..." Leslie leaned across the aisle. "Dominic's parents are away all week. Fun to be had, trips to take, guys to make, not my scene." "Come on, Ash." Leslie checked to be sure no one who should hear stood nearby, glancing up and down the aisle furtively, before she asked, "Ree's friend at the music shop got her that extra package she ordered too." Sometimes Aislin wished she could smoke a little, drink a little, but she couldn't. Once in a while she indulged if she planned to crash on Seth's sofa, but she couldn't risk walking through Huntsdale with her defenses down. "I don't think so," she said more firmly. "You could come along. You don't need a party. Just hang with us. It's not like I get lit, just relaxed." Leslie tried again. "Some of Dom's cousins are going to be there." "Thought they were all asses," Aislin asked with a smirk. "Sure, but his cousins are asses with hot, hot bods." "If you aren't going to do anything about Seth," Leslie gave her a lascivious grin. "A girl's got needs, right? Just think about it." Sister Mary Louise came in, saving Aislin from declining again. With her usual flourish, Sister Mary Louise paced across the front of the room, eyeing them from behind her patiently unattractive glasses. "What can you tell me?" It was one of the many reasons the class was Aislin's favorite. Sister Mary Louise didn't simply launch into a lecture. She got them talking, and then she slipped in her points, revealing every bit as much information, but with more style than any of the other teachers. Before anyone else could speak, Leslie announced, "If Othello had trusted Des, it would have all gone differently." Sister Mary Louise rewarded her with an encouraging smile, and then turned to Jeff, who objected to most of Leslie's comments. "Do you agree?" The class quickly turned into a debate with Aislin and Leslie on one side and Jeff's lone male voice on the other side. A few other people joined in periodically, but it was mostly her and Leslie against Jeff. Afterward, Aislin left Leslie at her locker and joined the crowd surging to the door. In all, her mood was a good one. Ending the day with her favorite class wasn't quite as good as starting with it, instead of starting with the torture that was calculus, but it was a close second. Then Aslan stepped into the main door. The fear she'd stifled that morning came flooding back. Outside, seated on the back of a wolf, was Dead Girl, looking every bit as terrifying as the other fairy. Keenan had at comics. Alright, and that's where I'm going to end for the night. Thank you for joining me, and